quite surprised that my second video turned out to be on the Mary Sue trope, but at the same time it makes sense, because writing a Mary Sue was the first mistake I made when I got into writing. And I say mistake, not because Mary Sues are always a bad thing, which we will touch upon later, but because I had no intention of writing one. And neither did I have a clue what I was doing. So let's start with the basics. What is a Mary Sue? We're already running into some obstacles here, as I could not find a consensus on what exactly defines a Mary Sue. The definition of a Mary Sue seems to be rather subjective. It's usually an intrinsic sense of the audience that something about a character is just too good to be true and feels undeserved. Usually this stems from the writer's own self-insertion of their fantastical desires. Mary Sues or Gary Stews can therefore be understood as a form of wish fulfillment. However, there's also definitely cases of writers who had absolutely no intention of writing a Mary Sue and still ended up with one. With all this in mind, the best definition of a Mary Sue or Gary Stew I could personally come up with is a character whose importance, appearance, mental and physical ability and the received praise toward these usually advantageous traits feels disproportionate from their perceived achievements and personality, or feel irrelevant to the story. So who often writes Mary Sues and Gary Stews? Technically everyone is capable of writing a Mary Sue, and probably has, whether intentionally or unintentionally. But there's 4 groups who are most likely to write a Mary Sue. First up, fanfic writers. When it comes to fanfic, writing a Mary Sue is often the point. Fanfiction is, in most cases, meant for wish fulfillment after all. Next up, adolescents. This has to do with many factors, but the main ones are definitely a lack of experience and the common urge of wanting to belong. Being an adolescent is hard, and so it's not unusual for teens or young adults to pour their fantasies of a cooler, more ideal self into their characters. Not every teen will seek belonging in this way, but the more introverted probably will. I know I did. The third group are members of minority communities. We still have a long way to go before reaching an acceptable amount of representation, diversity and inclusivity in popular media. We're getting there in storytelling, but decennia of misrepresentation make it so that the depictions are still not quite right, and that minority groups are still not fairly compromised for their contribution to the arts. This makes it so that members that consider themselves part of these marginalized groups will create their own versions of popular media, often exaggerating the heroics of a particular character who they've inserted themselves into and represents their culture, ethnicity, sexuality, disability or other less covered groups. In this case too, the writing of a Mary Sue can be intentional to create a better reputation for a marginalized group, or even just to get some exposure. And then of course, beginner writers. The craft of writing is expansive, so there's a lot to learn when first entering this magical world full of possibilities. Starting out, we don't always have the tools, techniques, or even the awareness to know how not to write a Mary Sue. This group often writes them unintentionally, and after listening to interviews of lots of professional writers, I noticed how all of them admitted that most of their first drafts still contain Mary Sues to a degree. They say that as you gain more experience, you'll get better at recognizing them, so you can adjust during revision. So then I got curious. Where and when did this Mary Sue, Gary Stew thing start anyway? Well, apparently, the Sues and Stews have their roots in fanfiction, where it became a very common phenomenon to feature a character who was in every way perfect and seemed to be an idealized version of the writer. Paula Smith then wrote her own Star Trek fanfiction, a parody named A Trekkie's Tale, in which a 15-year-old girl named Mary Sue saves the day all by herself and receives exaggerated praise for pretty much everything she says or does. The term Mary Sue was quickly adopted by various writers, and the variety Gary Stew, a Marty Stew, was later added to pertain to male Mary Sue characters. But these terms quickly expanded into a whole list of variations, most of which have sparked much debate, like the anti-Sue, the author avatar, the canon Sue, etc. I will not cover them all here, but I'll link some resources in the description box below in case you're curious. The last thing I quickly wanted to touch upon before we dive into the practical advice of preventing Mary Sue characters is when Mary Sues or Gary Stews are actually problematic. This comes down to intention and awareness. If your intention with writing a Mary Sue is to uplift an otherwise marginalized population or group, I do think a Mary Sue can be effective. However, if you don't personally belong to or are familiar with the group you're trying to help gain exposure, the result can backfire and might not be appreciated by those who do belong to the group you wrote about. If your intention is pure wish fulfillment, writing a Mary Sue is not that problematic. But in this case, I do think you need to be aware that altering an existing story or a well-loved character can ruin the story in the minds of other fans. Not that you have to take responsibility for how other people react to your stories, but again, coming back to that word intention, it's always a good idea to reflect on whether what you write or say will cause harm to someone else unnecessarily. In the Writing Excuses podcast, season 3, episode 16, they also briefly touch on whether you can purposely create a character as a manifestation of an aspect of you. Dan Wells explains you can if you're specific. In my interpretation, this means you can insert a small part of yourself, preferably a part of yourself you'd like to explore more, like a flaw or an aspect that grants your overall narrative more depth, because you could write it from your own experience. But even here, I think we need to be careful not to pick that one part of ourselves on which we pride ourselves, such as our education, because that might come across as ignorant. Unless we find ways to challenge that aspect of ourselves in our stories. Like inserting our educated selves onto a character who meets a streetwise wanderer who our MC looks down upon for his lack of formal education, but then comes to depend upon this character for survival, completely changing the perspective of the meaning of education that our MC had before. Before we know how to avoid Sus and Stus, we need to know why we disliked them in the first place. I identified a couple of reasons. Whether we're aware of it or not, we often visit stories because we like to see characters solve problems we can in some way, sometimes straining our imaginations a little, relate to. This makes a character who is in every way already perfect and capable incredibly boring. Suspense is derived from the knowledge that characters won't be able to survive or achieve whatever the story requires.
Until I become Hokage, I don't care what happens, I am not gonna die!
It's exactly this unlikeliness and the character's persistence despite all odds being against them that makes a story satisfying and makes a character's achievements feel deserved. You can imagine that if you take those hardships and obstacles away, there's not much left to root for. We also sometimes visit stories in the hopes of learning something that could help us solve similar problems. When a character is so perfect that they just miraculously overcome everything, we don't get the answers we came for in the first place. Another thing we don't like is that Mary Sue's can drag us out of a story when we can hear the writer directly talk to us through the character. Finally, a Mary Sue can feel incredibly rude or ungrateful. They're so capable and beautiful that there's no actual flaws or obstacles to overcome. Therefore, all they can do is complain, or us writers have to let them make dumb decisions to get the plot going. There's probably a lot more reasons why Sus and Stus are not the most liked characters, but I'll leave that up to you. Feel free to add your own reasons for disliking a Mary Sue character, or maybe you have a reason why you do like them. Let me know, I'm curious. So how can we avoid writing Mary Sues or Carrie Stus? To sum it up, the necessary ingredients to prevent a Mary Sue are relatability, flaws, limitations and clever ways to deal with them, and a sprinkle of gratitude or acknowledgement of personal blessings. But I figured all of this doesn't mean we can't write a capable, intelligent, likable, or even a physically beautiful character. I learned that there's 4 key factors to keep in mind when wanting to give our character positive traits without turning them into a Mary Sue. Relevance, intention, convenience, and believability. Here's how I figured we can apply these 4 key factors. Firstly, when making our characters extraordinarily good at something, we need to give it a clear reason. Why wouldn't others have these particular skills? What precise, unique experience did our character have? Edward from Full Metal Alchemist is a good example of this, as being the only one having experienced an encounter with the truth granted him the ability to perform alchemy without a transmutation circle. Aang is established as a bending prodigy early on in the story and has a spiritual nature that allows him to communicate with past lives for advice, which makes it believable that he's able to master the elements so quickly. Toph being blind makes it so that she depends on other senses to see, which explains her earthbending mastery. Second, flaws are more interesting than abilities, but we can't just give our character a random flaw. How does the flaw relate to their wound, backstory, cultural background, and perhaps personality? If we want the flaw to carry out a message, we need to make sure that every action, consequence and plot point is a direct result of their flaw. Just like Katniss gets herself into a lot of trouble by her antisocial and protective nature, or like Walter White refuses to drop his ego and as a result becomes the danger he wanted to protect his family against.
I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot and you think that of me? No. I am the one who knocks.
Thirdly, it's okay to make our characters outstandingly good looking so long we make sure their appearance doesn't in any way contradict our story. Like if I would write a story about bullying and insecurity, having a character that isn't always exceptionally handsome and able will deprive the story's message and make my character seem spoiled and annoying. This could also be a good opportunity to delve into cultures, genders, sexual orientations, or disabilities less written about. In this case though, if you're not part of this group yourself, I advise to do expensive research and consult with sensitivity readers. Something I see happen quite often is that writers will use mostly physical descriptions for the opposite sex while using personality traits when describing their own. This stems from a passionate desire that the writer may have, expressed as a description of their own ideal partner. Unfortunately, these inconsistent descriptions can cause one group to seem simple, while the other seems more complex and interesting. It can also come across as ignorant, for example when you only mention the skin color of black and brown characters and not those of white characters. A better way to go about this would be to compare our descriptions and make sure they all contain external as well as internal traits, and that we don't omit certain characteristics for specific groups. Fourthly, this is my favorite technique. We should give our characters a boundary at the beginning of the story, something they would never do. Then have them cross that boundary near the end of Act 2. I noticed this to be a powerful technique to establish change and reveal the dark side of a character. It's especially striking if the characters brought it upon themselves to cross their boundary by having been unable to overcome their flaw. In Breaking Bad, this is demonstrated when Jesse Pinkman commits murder, and when Walt accepts harming a child as part of his strategies. Now we don't have to make our character's boundary that dramatic though, we just need to make it fit our story's genre. Promising this transformation from abiding by a personal code to breaking that code without revealing how it will end can become a powerful hook. Our audience will want to find out if they'll overcome their flaw or if they'll stay there. Besides these main tips, there's a few additional ones I gathered to make sure we're not writing Mary Sue's. Most of them have to do with developing a unique voice. The first tip is to pick ideas and POVs on which you disagree. This will ensure we're not boasting our own ego and can actually be quite transformative for the writer. For me, this is why I wanted to become a writer in the first place. It gives me the opportunity to explore different mindsets and see the world as though I'm someone or something else. That brings me to the next tip. Go out into the world and find interesting characters, personalities or appearances to write about. If it captures your interest or attention, chances are it will capture someone else's too. Another irritation of the Mary Sue I read about a lot was their inconsistency. Their entire personality seems to change whenever it's convenient, and the same goes for their abilities, which often get a major upgrade right when they need it.
More power! I didn't care about anything, and then it happened.
To keep a character's voice consistent and away from your own, John Brown, on a podcast of Writer's Excuses, advised to get steeped in a voice or culture. Because just like our personal backgrounds and cultures inform our personality, speech and way of thinking, we need to make sure that's true for our characters as well. We can research how certain populations talk, or if you're a world builder, establish a list of rules and systems as Brandon Sanderson advised. He mentions that with a large cast of characters it can get really hard to keep all the voices straight and they will start to sound more and more like the writer. So when you write up a checklist of vocal rules for each character, you can go back in during revisions and make sure that every character's voice remains consistent with your list and throughout the book. Of course, I already went ahead and made a checklist like this, as well as a good template for developing a character's voice, which I personally use. I'll share this template on my Patreon. Thank me later. Another way to ensure a different perspective could be to have someone else in mind when writing a character. A friend, a celebrity, a family member, or even an animal. Then change some significant things about them. But be careful not to make a character just one thing. Our audience isn't supposed to start recognizing our vocal rulebook. I personally think Sokka is a great example of this. He's generally known as the clumsy funny guy.
It's pretty much my whole identity. Sokka, the meat and sarcasm guy. But I'm willing to be Sokka, the veggies and straight talk fellow. Deal?
But the writers never took away his agency and turned his character into so much more. They made sure his humor isn't what he is, but rather the result of what he is not yet. His arc focuses on overcoming his insecurity to become a respected leader like his father. But his efforts often result in hilarious situations, which he tries to further cover with lots of sarcasm and making fun of himself. Studying his character has taught me a lot about developing a voice for my characters that does their personalities justice. Dan Wells also makes a good point that most of us will not explain things that are familiar to us. So he warns not to have our characters suddenly explain everyday objects or customs, no matter how unusual they are to us. Our audience will know that's the author speaking to them. It's better to try and show this exposition. Or we can do what a lot of other writers do and insert a newbie character who asks all the questions the audience has about the world we created. Howard Taylor also added to deconstruct our own vocabulary to really know our own voice. That way we can tell whenever our character says something we would say. He advises to catch ourselves on using certain phrases a lot and see if it comes up in our character's dialogue. I use the word although a lot and the phrase of course. But I'm also writing gangsters who received little to no formal education, so every time I reread the dialogue for them, it sounds like I wrote a bunch of postgraduates who turned rogue. If only I was writing a comedy. So those are all the tips I collected on Stus and Stus. Let me know if there's something new you learned, or maybe you'd like to add your own tips. If not, then maybe you'd like to join the debate on the following statements, because I stumbled upon a lot of discussion surrounding these during my research. Aang and Harry Potter are Mary Sue's. Yes or no? What do you think? I'm curious to read your opinions. Thanks again for joining me on the exploration of this topic. I got lots more fun videos coming, but because I like to go in depth, they tend to take a lot of time. So I post every 2 weeks. In the meantime, you could check out my Ko-Fi where you can get a look behind the scenes, ask me questions, as well as find worksheets. Or you could visit my blog where I post all of my adapted video scripts to read upon later. I really hope this video inspired your writing in some way, so you can do your imagination justice.